Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our debate this evening. Just a few words from me tonight, and then I'll introduce our Associate Director, Debbie O'Malley. First, just a special welcome to all those who are taking part in the ISI conference. We're thrilled you're here, and thank you to ISI for co-sponsoring tonight's event. I'll be with you tomorrow speaking, but we're thrilled you can all make it here to South Bend to join us tonight. Many of you know we've had here in the center a number of events today, and they've all gone off flawlessly. So I just want to say thank you again to my staff, to Soren, to Mary Francis, to Zane. These guys are working very hard, and I'm deeply appreciative. So thank you to the staff. For you students at Notre Dame, if you're interested in the things we've been doing today, including events like tonight, I encourage you to go to our website, constudies.nd.edu. As I mentioned earlier today, we have an undergraduate minor, we have a fellows program, we have all sorts of events. We do these weekend seminars that are invitation only. So if you're interested in the things we've been doing today, including events like tonight, please come talk to me so you can, or go to our website so you can learn more about the minor. I'm going to introduce our Associate Director, and she's going to explain the format of tonight's event, and then we'll have one of our students introduce the speakers themselves. Debbie O'Malley is the Associate Director of the Center. Her PhD is from Baylor, and she'll explain tonight's format. So, Debbie?
Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you especially to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. We are delighted to present this debate as part of ISI's weekend-long conference, The Great American Storybook. The conference gathers college students from across the nation to explore the question of what it means to be an American. A few words on the format of tonight's debate, which will be a modified Lincoln Douglas style. Professor Otteson will give 12 minutes of initial remarks, followed by an 18-minute rebuttal from Professor Anton. Professor Otteson will then have 6 minutes to respond. After this initial exchange, each of our speakers will have the chance to present each other with 2 questions, and each can offer a 3-minute response to each of those 2 questions. We then have about 30 minutes of audience Q&A. In the CCCG, we have a tradition of inviting our students to introduce our distinguished guests. Tonight's speakers will be introduced by Charles Yockey, a senior at Notre Dame majoring in the program of liberal studies and minoring in constitutional studies. A native of Springfield, Illinois, he has been a Tocqueville Fellow for 4 years. Next year, Charlie will pursue an MPhil in political thought and intellectual history at Cambridge University.
Good evening, and welcome to Notre Dame. It's my great pleasure to introduce the interlocutors in tonight's debate, Professor James Otteson and Mr. Michael Anton. Professor Otteson is the John T. Ryan Jr. Professor of Business Ethics, Faculty Director of the Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership, and Faculty Director of the Honors Program at Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business. Professor Otteson is also a concurrent professor of political science and a senior scholar at the Fund for American Studies and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. His research focuses on business ethics, political economy, the history of economic thought, and 18th century moral philosophy. His most recent published works are Should Wealth Be Redistributed? A Debate, 7 Deadly Economic Sins, and The Essential David Hume. Prior to Notre Dame, Professor Otteson taught at Wake Forest University, New York University, Yeshiva University, Georgetown University, and the University of Alabama. Mr. Anton is a lecturer in politics and research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C. He's also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a former Trump administration official. Before that time, he worked as a speechwriter to New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, California Governor Pete Wilson, Rupert Murdoch, the National Security Council, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and President George W. Bush. Mr. Anton is most famous for his essay, The Flight 93 Election, as well as his eponymous book, in which he encouraged conservatives to support Donald Trump's bid for the presidency in 2016. Mr. Anton is also a Renaissance man, having trained as a French chef, worked as a businessman and financier, and written extensively on men's fashion and classical tailoring in The American, The Wall Street Journal, and City Journal, among other publications. There can scarcely be two more qualified men to opine on the topic of this evening, which is how moral are markets. Please join me in welcoming our two guests. And Dr. Otteson, you may begin.
Oh, my God. Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I will turn my mic down just a tad. There we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the privileges we enjoy by being part of a university community is the opportunity to encounter a variety of perspectives. Too often, I think, we shy away from controversial topics for fear of disagreement or because we think we can't have a productive discussion when people disagree. But if there is any place where discussion of controversial ideas can and should take place, it is a university. So I commend everyone here for accepting the challenge and the responsibility of the Academy to enter into the fray of the marketplace of ideas. I believe it to be our duty to charitably consider differing perspectives, which often requires us to explore perspectives different from our own, viewing them from the inside, as it were, even positions with which we strongly disagree, and I will do my best to do that tonight, as apparently I'm arguing from the left. All right, let's get to it. Our question is, how moral are markets? I would reframe that question as, how moral are people in markets? This is an important distinction. People are moral agents with reason and free will. Markets, by contrast, are not moral agents. They are arenas in which people exchange, transact, partner. Now, that's not to say that the logic of market transactions doesn't influence us or that people don't offer products and services that affect our desires, and sometimes negatively. But as moral agents, people are responsible for their choices regardless. If we could have chosen differently, then we are responsible and accountable for what we chose, good or bad. Now, because markets enable people to make many kinds of choices, inevitably people will make bad choices. Bad for themselves, bad for others, or both. But any criticism we would raise of bad choices should always begin with the agents making those choices, not with the instruments they use to effectuate their choices. So, asking how moral are markets is, in my view, a bit like asking how moral is the English language. Suppose you're a supporter of free speech. Does supporting a principle of free speech, or even a right to free speech, thereby entail that you support everything that gets said? Of course not. In fact, to assume that a defender of free speech might also defend everything that gets said constitutes a fundamental misunderstanding of the reasons for supporting free speech. And I think the analogy to support for a market economy is instructive. Do people say bad things or false things? Of course. Just as in markets, people sell bad things and make false promises. Do people use words to bully, manipulate, or intimidate others? Yes, just as in markets, people attempt to do the same thing. Is there such a thing as vicious speech? Indeed. Just as in markets, there are vicious products. Are some people so good at speaking that they can garner large audiences and sway crowds? And not always in good ways, absolutely. One glance at social media, and especially at so-called influencers, should immediately disabuse us of the notion that free speech necessarily means good speech. And many of these influencers routinely crowd out others, including worthier others. Some have audiences so large that they're virtual monopolies in their arenas. So perhaps if we limited or regulated or nudged speech, could we eliminate some of the bad, false, and ugly things that people say? Perhaps. But what's the downside risk of doing so? Well, first, it jeopardizes individuals' abilities to develop their identities, to become full human persons with reason, free will, and ultimately moral agency. If you are forcibly prevented from saying bad things, you get no moral credit for saying good things.
You get moral credit only when you have the full freedom to choose the wrong, but instead freely choose the right. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we're discussing adult human beings, so not children, but also not machines or pets or zoo animals. There's a strong urge among policymakers and sometimes advocates to call for policies that are parental, as if we were permanent children, or that treat us as if we were machines fit for engineers to tweak or fix us, or that assumes we just need to be kept fed, healthy, docile, and constrained, as if we were pets or zoo animals. But treating people as if they were the moral equivalent of something less than full moral agents is not respecting them as human beings. It's not respecting their dignity. Now, it's also the case that humanity has had a long and sordid history with suppression of speech. Some of the most tyrannical regimes in history have begun by nudging and then curtailing and then prohibiting speech, and then almost inevitably compelling only approved speech. Even with the best of intentions, this is a very dangerous road even to begin taking. Just consider, who among our political leaders today would you trust to devise and enforce the proper regulations of speech? Donald Trump? Joe Biden? Now, please don't tell me that you're sure there's some enlightened politician or expert out there who could do that with only wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. Even if there were, what are the chances that such persons would find their way into the proper offices or would even want to? On the contrary, what kind of person do you think would be most attracted to a putative office of speech regulation, the wise and benevolent moral exemplar or the demagoguing power seeker? Now, if those are some of the risks of curtailing speech, what are some of the risks of advocating speech? Discovery of truth? Yes. There's a clear and distinct benefit both to society and to individuals from a vigorous engagement with competing perspectives, namely that it is often the only way to make moral progress towards truth, especially moral truth. Sociality? Yes. When we engage with one another charitably, we learn to appreciate differences, different perspectives, breaking down stereotypes. Sometimes we learn things that we didn't know before or that we believed and turned out to be not true. We can also come to develop intellectual humility, civility, even politeness. But the most profound reason to support free speech is out of respect for human dignity. Human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. They are free moral agents, and they are thus possessed of equal dignity that demands our respect. Part of respecting one another's human dignity is acknowledging our diversity of experiences, diversity of perspectives, and diversity of visions of the good life. Acknowledging this diversity entails respecting that people's consciences might move them in different directions from our own, and it requires respecting their right to organize their lives and frame their purposes according to their own developing conceptions of the good. As Notre Dame's own president, Father John Jenkins, recently stated, I'm going to quote him, quote, "We should strive to combine a commitment to inquiry and dialogue in pursuit of truth with a commitment to show respect and charity towards those with whom we disagree. The most effective way to realize this ideal is not by silencing or excluding those who fail to live up to it, but by showing such respect in our own interactions and by calling others to do the same." Unquote. Okay, now how does all of this discussion of free speech relate to our topic tonight? Well, the fact that we are here having a debate, as opposed to, I suppose, a duel, suggests our support for the idea that offering and examining different ideas can not only be beneficial, but respectful of each other's dignity. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I propose for your consideration that the arguments for supporting free speech, including those I've just outlined, might apply to free economic choices as well. Let me explain. Persuasion is morally better than coercion. What economist Deirdre McCloskey calls the sweet talk of the marketplace is morally preferable to theft, conquest, and coercion. Voluntary cooperation is morally better than involuntary extraction. The moral superiority of discussing, of learning from others, of attempting to persuade one another, and of appreciating differing perspectives constitute reasons to resist allowing or empowering some to impose limits on how others may develop their personhood and express their values and beliefs in markets, just as in speech. So my suggestion is that the fact that you're here means not only that you're likely already committed to the freedom of speech, but that you are already also likely committed, maybe on only some level, to the principles underlying a market economy. But that no more means you're committed to everything that gets made or bought or sold or invested in an economy than you are to everything that gets said by people who express and use their right to free speech. So my argument ultimately rests on the first principle of human dignity and perhaps the somewhat surprising implications of taking human dignity seriously. One aspect of that is respecting people's rights to develop their identities, to form their consciences according to their own judgment, and to both acting and expressing their principles. That means respecting both their word choices and their economic choices. When we curtail either of those freedoms, we treat others as something less than full moral agents. Now, when I say respecting others' word or economic choices, I do not necessarily mean agreeing with them. Having the right to make those kinds of choices doesn't mean that one's choices are not susceptible to criticism, just as having the right to X does not mean one ought to do X. All of us make mistakes, we're all fallen creatures after all, but the proper response when people make mistakes in good faith or in bad is not to eliminate their freedom to make choices. It is instead, as Father Jenkins argues, to engage them as persons in charity and solidarity, to encourage, guide, and orient them towards good choices. In other words, in response to people behaving badly either in markets or in speech, we should not disrespect their dignity by curtailing their moral agency. Rather, we should do the honorable, if hard work of engaging their agency, using our powers of reason, speech, and persuasion, and animating them toward the good. Let me summarize my argument. One might think that while there may be few or even no rules that should restrict speech, there should certainly be some rules that restrict markets, and of course, yes, there must be rules. One can't play chess without respecting the rules of how the pieces move. One can't communicate in English or in any other language without respecting the rules of grammar. And we might capture most of the rules, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about this later, most of the rules that should undergird markets under the heading of justice. But the rules of justice themselves also ultimately depend on human dignity, which is exactly the same moral foundation on which the right to free speech and many other rights are grounded. So my argument in sum is this. Because they both ultimately depend on the principle of human dignity, the rights to free speech and to economic freedom should enjoy the same protections. I would also incidentally add freedom of religion. Consider, does allowing freedom of religion enable people to believe bad or false things? Of course it does. Does that constitute a reason to reject a right to free religious expression? No, it does not. So I would argue then that we should be just as wary letting anyone, including perhaps our interlocutor tonight, invade one of those freedoms, even with the best of intentions, as we would be to allowing invasion of any of the others. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm having a kind of a flashback here. Not an acid flashback, don't worry, I've only been drinking tea. But this is the third time something similar to this has happened to me, by which I mean, so a couple of years ago, I worked for Hillsdale College. I was asked to debate on foreign policy Bob Kagan, arch neocon. Guy, and I really do have some substantive disagreements with Bob Kagan, and we went out there and everybody kind of was in the audience looking for blood, thinking like this is going to be UFC style debate and people would get hurt, and that's what they were there for, like the people who go to the Indy 500 just to watch the crashes. And then, Kagan was very reasonable. He didn't say anything I disagreed with at that time, and the whole thing was mild, and people came up to me afterwards and they were like, what a letdown you are, man. So the second time, Patrick Deneen, who's in the room now. And I think there are levels at which Patrick Deneen and I seriously disagree, but they're way up at the high theoretical level. What we end up talking about is just a bunch of stuff that we both agree on. And we're just going, yeah, I think you're right about that, and I think you're right about that. And at the end, people are going, what? That wasn't a debate, right? What is wrong with you? So now I have to do it again. Because I didn't hear anything I disagreed with there, really, or not much. So I'll try, instead of picking that apart, which I can't do and I'm not inclined to do, to make some other, let's say, affirmative statements with which maybe people will disagree with. We'll see how it goes. So markets, are markets moral? I mean, I think the answer to that question is obviously a qualified no. That is to say, they're not moral, they're not immoral necessarily, they're just amoral. They can be used for moral ends, they can be used for immoral ends, they can be treated completely neutrally, and the people who run the markets can be completely indifferent to the ends. So what I believe, and I've a convert to this view, I've come around to it. So without going into like great biographical detail, look, I used to be a much more conventional economic conservative. I say that despite never having studied economics. The last economics class I took was in high school, so it's been quite a while for me. I've read a few books about it since then, including in preparation for today, just to get a refresher, but I'm no kind of expert. But I used to believe what basically any mainstream Republican or conservative believed from the Reagan era onward, which is, markets are good, minimal interference with markets in an economic are good, light touch, laissez-faire, low taxes, low regulation, and especially free trade. All of this was good, were great strengths that fueled the American economy. And I have changed my opinion on that, both because of what I personally witnessed in business myself, what I saw happening to industries around the country, to arguments that I read from other people, and in part, from what I saw as the enthusiastic reaction to Donald Trump's trade message, which really no American politician had forcefully advocated in a generation. The closest you can come to somebody making this case that he made was, very few in this room will even remember the name, but there was a very powerful congressman named Richard Gephardt of Missouri who rose to be the #2 Democrat in the House, and he ran for president in 2004 on an essentially protectionist or restrictive trade platform, and he didn't go anywhere. I don't even think he made it to the first primary, or if he did, he was out after the first primary. That position, that sort of protectionist position, was in a way, the proverbial $1 trillion bill lying on the sidewalk waiting for a politician to come along and pick it up. And none did, because trade orthodoxy had become entrenched in both parties. Remember that the Democratic Party used to be the Labor Party, used to be the Union Party, the pro-union party. It was for protection for its labor members. The NAFTA agreement, the famous NAFTA agreement, was drafted under a Republican administration, that of George H.W. Bush, who expected to get 2 terms and didn't get the treaty ratified before he was out. And it was thought that the thing would die because a new Democratic administration was coming in, and Democratic administrations are, to say the least, skeptical of free trade agreements and wouldn't ratify it. And Bill Clinton was persuaded to get it ratified and had to do so in an overwhelmingly Democratic House without the votes of the Democratic caucus, on the backs of the votes of the Republican caucus. And that essentially flipped the Democratic position on trade to align it with the Republican position. And so until the rise of Trump, the parties were, for all intents and purposes, the same. That's just a little bit of the history there. And now we have finally, some dissension and more of a 2-party competition, and this is open to debate. Now, I don't want to make this all about trade necessarily, although that's what I studied the most in preparation for this, because I think that's perhaps where the greatest amount of political controversy is right now. The analogy between speech and markets, I think, only takes you ultimately so far, okay? I basically agree with one great big caveat, which I'll summarize as quickly as I can, that speech should be as absolutely unregulated as possible in a liberal democracy, certainly in a country such as ours with the First Amendment. Now, why did the founders include the First Amendment? Leave aside the other provisions, the provisions specifically about speech. They included it because in a small r Republican government, based on the consent of the government, in which the direction of the government is moved by public opinion, the only way to move public opinion is to argue in public about what the direction of the government should be. And if you have any kind of limitations on public deliberation, they thought that small r republicanism would be impossible and the country would regress into despotism or the same kind of monarchism or oligarchy or aristocracy that they had worked to overthrow and never wanted to see the United States revert into. You have to have free speech in that context, and it needs to be as little regulated as possible, and in fact, essentially unregulated by the government with certain exceptions. And keep in mind that for the founders, things like expression, that the courts begin to expand the definition of speech in the middle of the 20th century, they would have had no patience for. They would have just said, that's not speech, right? Speech is arguing about, fundamentally, it's arguing about the direction of the government, what policies the government ought to take, and so on. And it's not this particular act or that particular obscenity or whatever. They had the same people, the same statesmen who drafted the First Amendment, had absolutely no problem with government interference in markets. And not only did they argue in favor of it at the theoretical level, they put it into practice. Okay, the very first law, substantive law, passed by the first Congress in 1789, after they had to pass a few sort of housekeeping bills and arrangements of committees and stuff, was the Tariff Act of 1789, okay, which is an interference in the markets. No question about it. It's certainly not free market. It's certainly not free trade, I should say, and it's not free market. They didn't have a problem with that. Why not? Because they thought that markets ought to serve the common good, and while they were basically free market in orientation, and they certainly didn't want, to go back to some language, the market either picking winners or acting coercively. They thought that government steering markets in certain directions would be beneficial to the American people as a whole and to the American government and Commonwealth specifically. So I'll just give you a couple of the arguments, for instance, that Alexander Hamilton, obviously we all know who he was. This is before he became famous on Broadway. He was Secretary of the Treasury long ago. And he wrote a report in 1791 called a Report on Manufactures. Okay, and he makes a bunch of arguments in favor of why the United States both needs tariffs and an industrial policy. Now, tariffs and an industrial policy are, of course, both very not free market. I should concede that much, I guess. They are interferences in the market. But they thought, okay, first of all, the United States lacks the industry that have already matured in Europe. And if we simply have open competition with mature industries in Europe, we can't possibly catch up to them. They will crush us on a cost basis and on a scale basis and so on. And our industries will never catch up. So we are not only willing, we are perfectly happy to distort the market deliberately so that nascent American industries can catch up and have a chance to be born when they would be crushed in a completely free system against foreign competition. They thought that the only way America would survive and thrive as a free republic would be for it to become essentially very wealthy. I mean, they're actually quite candid about this. If you read some of those early Federalist Papers, in particular Federalist 11, Federalist 12, Federalist 34, they say that one of the ends meaning goals in this sense, of the American government, of any good government, is to produce prosperity for its citizens. They say that as a general matter, and they say specifically, we notice in the American people a commercial spirit, a kind of restless energy toward bettering their material condition. That's what the American people like to do, and the government needs to fit the character of the people, and we need to create conditions where the Americans can create wealth. They thought that ultimately the national security of the United States depended on controlling certain industries. We don't want to be in a position, for instance, they argue quite specifically, of having to import materials crucial to national security from countries that may be indifferent to our security, or worse, may sometime down the line become hostile to our security. Now, I'm not a detailed expert on the following, but I can say from direct experience, and I'm sure you've all read headlines to this effect too, and disturbing stories, that's not the position the United States is in right now, in part because of decades of industrial mismanagement, outsourcing, bad policies. We now rely on a lot of our military technology relies on supply chain issues that trace back to countries that either already are, let us say, at least adversaries and could become outright enemies down the line. And what happens then when we say, well, we can't fix these jets without these certain parts, and some unnamed country, you can guess which one I might be thinking of, says, oh, we're just not going to sell them to you anymore. Well, Hamilton saw that clearly from the beginning and said we don't ever want to be in that position. And if it means we have to distort the markets and even produce certain things less efficiently than according to the law of comparative advantage, which, by the way, was not yet formulated as an idea, that would be 1817 with David Ricardo, but the basic concept is already out there. It's foolhardy of me to even bring up the name of Adam Smith against a philosophy professor who basically wrote his dissertation on that, and that's the main thing he studies, because I can get my clock clean doing that, but I'm going to risk it anyway, right? Even this idea is at least implied in Smith, which of course was published in that momentous year, Wealth of Nations, 1776. They thought, okay, we may end up with a less efficient industries in certain ways that produce the same goods for more money, but that's a price we're going to have to pay for our national security and for our economic security and for the viability of US industries. And I think in hindsight, like I said, I went through a long period where I was economically more ignorant than I am now. I'm still pretty ignorant, but just maybe a little bit less, where I didn't believe that. I bought all of the, when you're my age and you grew up during the Reagan presidency, which was a great time if you're conservative, if you're right of center. I suppose if you were a liberal in 1985, it was a miserable time to be alive, a 49 state lost behind you, very depressing. But for me, it was great. And so I believed everything that the Cato Institute and AEI were saying about Reagan economic policy, and I took that with me for the next 20 or so years. But looking back on it now, restudying the founders on these questions, now I wonder, now I doubt, and now I'm starting to come out on the other side. Another thing that I would say is, if the free trade orthodoxy of the economists and the people who've been pushing it is as correct as they say it is, they have a problem in how often it's been belied by history. Our own history, I just give 3 examples. I could give others, but I'll give 3 that are really telling. One is the history of the United States, the second is the history of Great Britain, and the third is the history of Japan. So the United States was essentially a pretty strongly tariffed country for most of its existence. And in fact, one of the most protectionist periods of the US economy and body politic was the immediate post-Civil War era up into the Great Depression. And if free trade is always a net drag on countries' economies, the United States should have been an economic basket case during that period, but it was one of the strongest periods of economic growth in any country in the history of the world. Okay, Great Britain went through a sort of agonizing debate on its tariff policy throughout the 19th century. I don't want to go into the history very, very, very deeply, but I have now been persuaded by reading various economic analysis that Britain lost its industrial edge in part by embracing free trade in exactly the moment it shouldn't have, in exactly the industries that it shouldn't have, and its economic decline began much sooner than anybody today imagines. And the final example, which I can say from firsthand experience, is Japan, right? If the kind of protectionist economy distorting inefficiencies that free traders decry were always fatal to economic health, Japan should also be a basket case. And in fact, if you read certain financial analyses, you would think that it is. You're all young students, so I'll again throw out the age card here. So I'm a little older. I can tell you things that were going on before you were born. Well, Japan was doing, on paper, great in the 1980s, so much so that the United States was terrified that the Japanese economy would overtake the US economy and well, to borrow a phrase from Khrushchev, would bury us, right? And it got to a point where the Nikkei, the Japanese stock market, and the Tokyo property market were so overvalued in 1989 that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo were considered to be worth more than all the land in the entire state of California. And then the bubble burst on both of them, and to a certain extent, they've never recovered. And a lot of financial analysts in the West have been saying, first it was Japan's lost decade, that was the 1990s, and the second lost decade, right? Well, Japan, now we're in like the lost century. So you'd think, gosh, it must be like Hoovervilles over there, right? It's just got to look like the FDR administration. And then I went to Japan, first time in 97, I've been back several times, and you look around and it doesn't look that bad. In fact, it looks great. Their economy is booming. Their economy is doing extremely well. Their standard of living is very, very high. They haven't done any of the things that Western free traders or Harvard economists, nothing against Harvard economists, some of them are pretty good, have told them to, because they don't want to, and they don't seem to have suffered much for it. Maybe there were some opportunity costs that the Nikkei could be 2x what it is now, but in terms of the political health of Japan, the economic health of Japan, the day-to-day life of a Japanese citizen, the health of its corporations, it's all very, very strong, and they did all that on what we would call, disparagingly, a basically mercantilist economic policy, right? So all of this is to say, to make markets moral, from my perspective, or to make them more moral, it's actually wise, certainly permissible and even wise, to have good government policy steer, direct, tweak, cajole, even distort the economy for the common good. And that used to be something that Americans took for granted and did eagerly, and we convinced ourselves Not merely that it was bad policy, but somehow that it was immoral. And I think that was a mistake, and I think we've lost a lot of ground. And I think I'm about to get the hook, so I want to bring up the last morality question that I want to raise, which is, okay, this is where I've really, drifted to the left over the course of my life, right? Conservative intellectuals, Republican politicians, et cetera, used to, and still really do, absolutely not care about the question of income or wealth inequality, right? As long as a certain standard of living is met, as long as the overall pie is growing, who cares about the differential between the top and the bottom? That shouldn't matter. And I have come to the view that I think it does matter. That's not to say that I'm arguing for straight up redistribution or expropriation, nor would I use Aristotle's argument. Aristotle says in politics, I can't remember exactly where, Phil probably could tell you the Becker number off the top of his head, but he says that the greatest wealth differential in a healthy city should be no more than 5-to-1. So the richest citizen should have no more than 5 times the property of the poorest citizen. Obviously, we don't live in that society right now, and nor am I advocating for it. If you compare whatever Elon Musk is worth, depending on the stock price of Tesla at a given time, to what an IHOP waitress makes, it's bigger than 5-to-1. It's probably 50 to 500 orders of magnitude bigger. Okay? So I'm not arguing for that level of concision. I am saying that we've let things get way out of hand, and that has a negative impact, I think, on social cohesion. I think it explains a lot of the divisions in the country, both class divisions, socioeconomic divisions, and the geographic divisions. And we could use better policy to get that under control without violating the morality of free markets, without doing expropriation, redistribution, or things like that. And I hope that the broader economic conversation in American politics keeps trending in that direction.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I did perk up my ears when you mentioned Adam Smith, but luckily I don't think you said anything true about Smith, so I don't need to address that directly. One thing Smith did say is that there's a great deal of ruin in a nation. That's a famous phrase from Adam Smith, because big nations have lots of policies. So when we talk about only the trade policy and we try to use that to explain all of the vicissitudes of a country's economy, well, that risks not just simplifying, but making things much more simplistic. But I would like to return to the topic of our discussion, which is a moral argument, not just the economic argument. Pope Benedict XVI, if I may quote him for a second, in Caritas in Veritate said, "Integral human development presupposes the responsible freedom of the individual and of peoples." He emphasized the point. Only when it is free can development be integrally human, and only in a climate of responsible freedom can it grow in a satisfactory manner. Now note the Holy Father's emphasis not only on the necessity of freedom, but also on integral human development. That's a moral argument. Human beings are special creatures. They are moral agents with freedom and accountability, and thus dignity, as I've said before. Now, of course, they all make mistakes, and we all make mistakes. But part of respecting human dignity is allowing them the responsible freedom to the sanctity of their consciences and to making decisions for themselves, which, as Pope Benedict argues, is the only condition under which they can develop as human beings. I would add, similarly with freedom generally, allowing human beings the freedom of their moral agency does not guarantee that they will make only good or virtuous choices. On the contrary, we know, as God did, that giving human beings free will entails that they will inevitably make some bad choices. But it also enables the chance of making good choices. Only when it is free can a choice be virtuous. Only when a human being is free does he or she have the opportunity for integral human development. Now, one might lament, and understandably, that our political institutions do not promote, or perhaps don't even allow, a single conception of the good, and hence they might fail to encourage us in proper virtue. Well, a central project, an essential aspect of the liberal political project has been from its beginnings almost 400 years ago to give up on a utopian idea of creating a commonwealth of virtue that is organized and managed by wise philosopher kings. This is a fallacy that we have seen many times, and we have seen this movie, and it does not end well. My interlocutor here is the latest in a very long list of people who is sure that with the right enlightened statesman, perhaps he and his friends, they can steer an economy that involves billions of choices every day by hundreds of millions of people, not just in this country, but billions of people around the world. Speaking of orders of magnitude, that would require an intelligence, and of course I mean no disrespect to anyone in this audience in particular, but that would require a level of knowledge that is orders of magnitude beyond anything that any single human being could possibly possess. Well, what does the liberal project note? It notes that despite the thousands of attempts over many centuries, there were far more failures to compel our way to virtuous citizenry than there were successes. So, liberal thinkers thought if pluralism in our religious views and our conceptions of the good life and our moral values here to stay, as it appears it is, then perhaps our politics should aim instead at creating an arena in which people could live together peacefully, perhaps without killing each other. And perhaps some skepticism is in order regarding asking our political leaders to discern proper morality for us and the proper directions for our society, and then to impose it on the rest of us. Now, some critics of this liberal order will point out that it has led to various pathologies. We got a few of these kinds of criticisms here just a moment ago. And of course, not only has its freedom enabled people to lead less than virtuous lives, but it's also left many people feeling unmoored, without moral guardrails. Some people have indeed gone off the moral rails, all true. But a serious evaluation, and this would be perhaps the first question I would put to my interlocutor, a serious evaluation of this requires that we ask, compared to what? If all human beings are limited in their knowledge and virtue, and if we are all fallen and imperfect, and if that includes our political leaders too, then there is no system of political economy that is or ever will be perfect. So the question becomes then, which system is the least bad among the alternatives? That question requires an objective look at the various experiments humans have conducted into organizing themselves, at the various systems of political economy that have been attempted, and a dispassionate evaluation, warts and all. Now, before we forego, we've heard some of the negatives potentially associated with liberalism. What goes on the positive side? Well, first and foremost, and again, let me conclude with a moral argument. We've seen a gradual extension of human rights, of human dignity, to ever more people, more than at any time in our human history. That includes extension of the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and democracy. Now, before we decide to forego those benefits, we should ask ourselves whether any other system of political economy can match its benefits, and even given the problems it faces. Is there another system of political economy that respects human dignity but does not face even more pressing challenges? I would suggest that history does not appear to have yet revealed a promising alternative contender. So a liberal political order does indeed have its flaws, and pointing them out is easy to do. But rejecting the system because of such imperfections would be like rejecting free speech because people sometimes say bad things, or rejecting modern medicine because some people sometimes die in hospitals. Thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. We're going to go to our refinement of our Lincoln-Douglas model, and we're going to let the two interlocutors ask one another questions with short responses. So, Professor Anton, you get to ask the first question to Professor Otteson.
Okay, first, I'm supposed to stand, excuse me.
Stand at the same.
I want to defend my honor on having said nothing true about Adam Smith. He definitely did publish The Wealth of Nations in 1776.
That's true.
The only other thing I said is that the theory of comparative advantage is not spelled out so-called in his work, but implied. I think that's right too, but if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected. So if I'm asking questions, I guess my question that I thought of is, how does a tariff restrain individual choice in the human sense, or is it some kind of restriction on freedom? Because I generally don't see it. You still have the choice to buy or not buy. It's distortive, I totally see that, but in the way, restrictive of freedom would be, you can't work in this industry, or you can't make that product, or so on. Not, it'll cost you a little more, or we're going to tell you where you can get certain inputs from and where you can't.
Oh, I have 3 minutes. That was your 3-minute question?
Was my question supposed to be 3 minutes? Okay.
Oh, and a 3-minute response. How do tariffs distort economic freedom? Was that the question?
No, human freedom. I know how they distort economic freedom, but
How
like
do they distort human
freedom?
freedom? So my argument, recall, was based on a generalized conception of human freedom with the foundation of human dignity. What do tariffs do? Well, tariffs are the imposition of various kinds of costs on goods and services that might come from other countries. Your question is, does it restrict human freedom? Let me ask you, let me raise the possibility of a question. Is there a difference between an ability to pay for something and a willingness to pay for something? If you recognize that there might be a distinction between an ability to pay for a good or service and a willingness to pay for a good or service, then that's the answer to your question. Because what you're effectively doing is saying, if the only cars we allowed to be sold in the United States are Mercedes, how does that affect anybody's human freedom? Well, what it would mean is that there's an entire proportion of the population who therefore doesn't get to drive a car. Now, does that restrict their freedom? Yes, it does. Suppose we say that the only houses in which people might be able to live are LEED certified houses, okay? What's that going to do? That's going to triple or quadruple the cost of housing in the United States. Does that restrict their freedom? Of course it does. But I would push the argument just a little bit further back. I think one of the assumptions that you're making in your argument, and I'm perhaps imputing more to you than is true, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the assumptions you're making in your argument is that there is somebody out there, perhaps you, perhaps former President Trump, who's pretty sure that he knows exactly which are the tariffs that we should have and which are the tariffs we shouldn't have, which are the goods that are important for our people for our own citizens to buy and sell, and which are the goods and services that our citizens should not buy and sell. What on earth would give you reason to think that that's true? How could a person know that? And remember, ladies and gentlemen, I would say also to my interlocutor, it is not countries that trade with one another. It is people who trade with one another. It is I who trade with you and you who trade with me. So the idea that what we should have is a country's national trading policy, I think, is a category mistake. So the policies that you're talking about, the kind of tariff policies that you're talking about, do in fact, they don't affect the freedom, perhaps, of the country, because the country is not an agent. What it does affect is the freedom of the individuals within the country. And if you're going to do that, then you better have a pretty good reason, and I have not yet seen what the reason would be for us to trust that our political leaders are in a position, or perhaps the political leaders we're thinking of are in a position to know what would be a good reason to do that.
Okay, thank you. Professor Otteson, your chance to ask Professor Anton a question, and Professor Anton, you'll have 3 minutes to respond.
Now, thank you. Well, let me ask a question related to what we might call, what's related to the topic we've just been discussing, which is local knowledge. So much of the information on which policymakers are making decisions about things like tariffs or trade policies and a large range of other things are based on aggregated knowledge. So they're based on information that we have assembled across large populations, aggregated average knowledge. How do we know when that actually applies to a human being, an individual human being? And let me be more specific. Let's take a moral argument, maybe a virtue. How do we know when a person is being sufficiently charitable or sufficiently courageous? Well, you can give a definition of those terms, but what you can't know is whether from afar another person is actually being courageous or charitable. What you can't know is what good or service from afar is actually advantageous or beneficial to an individual person. So how could a person, a centrally located person, know what's actually in the interest, economic or otherwise, of 330 million people in a country?
They wouldn't have to. I think it's a false choice that's being posited. That is to say, you can either do nothing or you can try to do everything, and there's no option in between. So you have to butt out of the market entirely, or you have to try to be, the Plato's philosopher king and regulate everything, and there's no middle ground. But in fact, nations, at least as successful as ours, and more successful than ours lately in the economic realm, routinely practice the middle ground. They routinely interfere in their economies for national ends, and they do so very successfully. They have captured entire industries from us, almost blown many of our previously most successful industries out of the water, drained them dry in this country, depriving us of an industrial base, millions of good-paying jobs, emptying out communities, cratering living standards, stagnating American wages that in many cases, in many sectors, in most sectors, have been flat in real terms after inflation-adjusted dollars since 1970. That's not a successful economic policy, as I see it, when we have in fact been more liberal. Now, the United States definitely does not have an economy, everybody would have to agree with this, that is completely open where nobody in the government is trying to make choices. It has all kinds of government regulations. I just think it has, for the most part, in the aggregate, the wrong ones that are not serving American interests, either the interests of the nation as a whole, of its industries, or of the people who work in those industries, or of the people who invest in them. So the choice isn't between doing nothing or trying to do everything. It's doing something in the middle and picking the right things, and the evidence that it's possible to do that is that A, other countries are doing it successfully now, and B, our country used to do it successfully in the past, and in fact, for more of its history, about maybe not quite 200 years, but 150 to 175 years was much more successful at intervening in the economy in ways that help American citizens, help American industries, and help American communities. And when it has gone in a more liberal direction, our economy has been basically in decline, a decline papered over by the roaring success of certain sectors, in particular tech and finance. But we're losing the tech industry now. And many of the most successful drivers of the tech industry and the hardware are almost entirely gone from the United States at this point. That's the thing that Silicon Valley doesn't tell you much about. Although I'll give you one little, if you buy an iPhone, you'll look on the side of it, notice what it says. It says designed in California, made in China. It doesn't even say designed in the United States, but we can go into the reasons for why that little particular distinction is made, right? We don't make stuff, and even the design is now starting to move on into other countries. So look, and as for just a couple points, look, as for the Mercedes and the lead, those are not the results of tariffs. Those are hypothetical policies that, first of all, don't exist. There's no American policy that would say you'd be restricted to buying a car from one particular
just give you a
maker.
chance.
It would never. We all know that would never happen. Even if I, who would be the wrong person to design our new industrial policy, tried to design it and I made 10 million mistakes, you would not end up with a regime where you were forced to buy only one brand of car. And the same is of the lead household. So I don't still see a restriction on the individual consumer's freedom from tariffs. I see distortions to the market that owners may not like because it lowers their return on capital, but I also see many potential and actual benefits from doing that in other sectors of the economy and in other sectors of the labor force, all of which used to be in operation when we used to have different policies than we do now, and when the Gini coefficient was lower, when middle class wages were higher, and all kinds of other metrics of societal health were higher when we had very different economic policies than we do now, and policies that were admittedly distortive by the standards of economic liberalism.
Okay, we're going to do one more round of back and forth, just like we did. After this round is finished, we'll take questions from the audience, and we always have a preference for student questions. Don't line up yet. Let the two gentlemen do their next round. When you do line up, we have a microphone right here in front in the middle, and we'll ask students to ask their questions first. Please identify yourself when you ask your question, your affiliation, whether you're at Notre Dame or elsewhere. Okay, so we're second round here. Professor Anton, question to Professor Otteson.
Yeah, I didn't have time to write one down, so I'll think of one on the fly. Yeah, I guess I don't. So I thought I would like clarity on the following, because I don't see anybody as rejecting the liberal system. Again, that's an either or. Like you either have a philosopher king or you have complete laissez-faire and no intervention. There's no one saying, certainly not me. I don't think anybody. Donald Trump, Peter Navarro, the big protectionist types in his administration, Bob Lighthizer. No one's saying we're going to reject liberal capitalism. They're saying we regulate it in a certain way now. We should regulate it in a different way, right? There's not much, aside from the Bernie Bros, there's not much of a constituency in the United States and AOC, I guess, and her Instagram followers. There's not much of a big constituency in the United States for socialism, for actual communism or anything like that. So no one's talking about rejecting liberalism. So that strikes me as a false choice. So if you could elaborate what you mean, like if you actually see an argument someone's making for the complete rejection of the capitalist system. I don't, but maybe I haven't come across it. I don't know. Where is that? Who's saying that?
Oh, there are plenty of people making that argument, but maybe not you. So let's not attribute that to you. But what we can think of, maybe this is more instructive to think about this. We can think of a continuum on which we have countries that are completely centrally economically planned versus countries that have no centralized economic planning whatsoever. This is a continuum. It's not an all or none, and we can think about different countries and different policies placed in different places, different parts of that continuum. We might use the criteria for where we put countries or policies, or maybe politicians, if you like, on that criterion, on that continuum, based on the criterion of who's actually making economic or political economic decisions. Are they tending to be made more centrally? Are they tending to be made more decentrally? So that gives us something of an either or. But the interesting way, what that can enable us to do then is we can look at other countries, including our own, and think about them on that continuum. So we might think about and rank countries according to that continuum, whether they're mostly decentralized or mostly centralized. And then the interesting thing about that is that what we can then do is look at how citizens are faring in those countries. Now, that's not just a hypothetical thing we can think about. In fact, we've been doing that for quite some time. Since at least the last 40 to 50 years, we've been developing data about countries like this. And so we don't just have to have a theoretical conversation about it, we can actually look at the data about that. But it seems like you were talking about a time when there was some time in the past when things were much better than they are now. That too is a very old claim to be made. When I was born, life expectancy in the United States, I'm not sure what period you're thinking about. Maybe you're thinking about the 50s or the 60s, I don't know, the 70s, maybe even earlier than that, sometime after World War II. Among the things that we had then were much lower longevity and much greater poverty in the United States. So we have improved on some of the important metrics. But here's something I would like to emphasize in relation to this, well, sort of all or nothing, and we want to just have the right people managing just the right things and not the wrong things, and we'll just get some of it. One happy implication, I would say, of the position that I've been arguing for, that I would argue for, called liberalism, is that sometimes other people have rights too. Other people, including those in other countries. You mentioned, well, they're stealing our technologies, or they're stealing our jobs, or they're stealing our fill in the blank. Well, those people who are getting jobs and producing goods and services, those are human beings too. And I think one of the dangers of the kind of view that you're advocating is a xenophobia that sees other people who are outside of our borders as somehow alien, not just alien, but also enemies. They are not aliens, they are not enemies, they are human beings with dignity just like us. So I would say one of the things that we can do in my concluding remark, when we're thinking about how to deal with other people in other countries, we should think about them as being equal in human dignity to us. And if that means that we have to consider them as bearing the same rights as us and being entitled to the same liberties and dignities as we are, then that's one of the prices we pay for living in a free society that recognizes all people as being possessed of human dignity.
Okay, Professor Otteson, a question to Professor Anton, and of course you can use part of your time to respond to that remark as well. Go ahead, Professor Otteson.
So I'm asking a question now, am I? Is that what I'm doing? I'm asking a question.
You don't have to if you don't want to. You gave me enough to chew on.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about these other countries that are doing so well and why it is you think they're doing so well. You mentioned Japan in particular. So you mentioned a couple of things about Japan, but there are other things that you might think about with respect to Japan and some other countries. For example, Japan is about to go off a demographic cliff. So they have virtually no children, and the age of the average Japanese person is rising rapidly. Demography is not necessarily destiny, but it certainly does have a large effect. Could there be other things going on in some of these other countries other than just trade policy?
Solely from the perspective of economic policy. Yes, Japan has a low birth rate, one of the lower, but basically every country, regardless of culture, religion, geographic location, this is one of the sort of fundamental constants of modernity, and no one has figured out exactly why yet, but you can be in any hemisphere, on any continent, of any demographic group, of any religion. Once you exceed a certain level of development and per capita income, birth rates go down. So even in a nominal theocracy like Iran, you would think, well, there's got to be having a lot of kids in Iran. No, their birth rates are, of the southern, the Spain, Italy, Singapore level. Not quite that low, but low. And this is also regardless of what the trade policies of given countries are. There doesn't seem to be any correlation between its trade policy or whether it has an industrial policy or how much it interferes in the marketplace and its demographic profile and its birth rate or TFR. Right? TFR is a huge problem for the developed world. I don't deny that at all. I don't think we can solve it with economic policy, and I've never made that case, but I also don't think that the right economic policy or the wrong economic policy has driven it or can fix it. You said earlier, not countries, but people or businesses trade with one another. That's the kind of, that statement is true, but I think profoundly misleading. Okay, yes, it's true, countries don't trade with one another, but other countries think about how their people and how their countries trade with other countries, and they try to steer policies that benefit their companies, their industries, and ultimately their country, and we used to think about that, and we don't anymore. And so we are at a disadvantage in trading with these countries, and they are succeeding in ways that we aren't succeeding because they're doing things that we could do and used to do, but don't do anymore. In terms of the question of standard of living, well, of course they've risen, and they've risen all over the world, but you can't ascribe that to modern trade policy. Life expectancy, aggregate wealth, all kinds of metrics of human development shot up throughout the 19th century in America when we had tariffs, right? I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but you were certainly bound you were very likely demographically or actuarially to live a lot longer in 1900 than you were in 1800, when the average American, just to take one statistic, tariff throughout this whole period was somewhere in the low to mid 30% the whole time. And life expectancy kept going up even as we changed trade policy because of advances in medical technology. I just don't think you can link the two. The fact is, when you say you want to go back to a better policy, it doesn't mean I want to go back in time to every policy that prevailed at a given time. There are certain things that we got wrong in the past, and we ought to keep doing the things that we're doing now that we changed. But there are certain things that we were doing better in the past that we could go back to and do better now. And basically what I'm hearing, and I hear this a lot, I heard it a lot in government, and I heard it from various intellectuals and such my whole life, is we can't do other than what we're doing because there is no other way. All alternatives are worse, and if you go back far enough in the past, it's benighted, and nobody wants to go back to that benighted past. Well, you can. I think we can do other than what we're doing, and I think we can look at the past and pick and choose the successes and leave behind the failures where they ought to be and still do better economically overall for our industries, our workers, our people. And I know I got a hook, but this one other point is very important. It was asserted that other people in other countries are not aliens but human beings. I think you just have to change one word to make that sentence true. They are aliens and human beings. By definition, they're aliens. They're foreigners. They're not American citizens, right? I remember reading some of you in the room were with me earlier where I mentioned an Atlantic article that I read years ago. And I gave one of the quotes that annoyed me then. I'll give you another one where some hedge fund guy, unnamed, we don't know who it was, said, look, it's estimated by certain economists that for every worker pushed out, that is pushed downwardly out of the middle class in America, another worker in China rises from agricultural poverty, or maybe he even said two, and that's a good trade. But that can't be the right perspective for an American statesman. If it is, if we're all just human beings, then the very expensive US labor market should simply be open to the world, and every job left in America, as a moral matter, ought to go to some country where the labor market can undercut American wages. And that means pretty much 90 to, I don't know what the percentage is, but a very high percentage of world countries have a much less expensive labor market than the US. So in a sense, then, we're being immoral anytime we pay somebody in the United States higher than the prevailing wage of what they would get paid in another country. And it ought to be our responsibility to outsource all of our economy and prosperity to lift these other people out of poverty because they're human beings too. And getting back to the alternative to liberalism, which you think I'm somehow for and must be a closet socialist, that's basically a socialistic argument or leads in a socialistic direction. We have not achieved morality until wages worldwide reach a kind of equilibrium where they're the same everywhere. And the only way that happens is when the high wage countries like the United States wages get pushed rapidly and very far downward. And I don't think that that's good for the American people. I also don't think any American statesman could pursue such a policy responsibly and say that he is looking out for the common good of the United States, or, to quote the preamble of the Constitution, the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity.
Okay, I'm going to invite Professor Jim, do you want a quick response on that last point while we...
Yeah, I don't know who was making a claim like that. I think you're assuming that there is...
Students, why don't you come line up, and we'll get, as the students come... Sorry to interrupt. Last comment on the...
Last comment.
Yeah.
You're assuming a zero-sum world. It is possible for us to get better while other people get better. So the idea that that the only way to improve a worker's position in another country is by depressing a worker in the United States is not only empirically false, but it's also morally not a position that I or anybody else that I was citing would have argued for. We live in a positive sum world.
Okay. At some point, we're going to have to go home. So we're going to try to keep our answers very short. We have a lot of questions, and we want to get as many student questions in. So students, this is especially important for you. Ask a question. You can tell us what you think about things later, okay? So only very short questions, okay? And tell us who you are as well.
Kyle Reynolds from Indiana University. Perhaps a few questions on some of the economic...
Just one.
Well, it's just...
We've got a lot of people, just one.
Okay. A question on some of the economic case studies Professor Anton presented. One with regard to the success of the Japanese economy. Much of that success was built on debt. The national debt is well over 200% of the gross production of the economy, and personal debt, household debt is also staggeringly high. At some point, it seems the country will have to deal with this debt, and that their perhaps appearance of success is not going to be with longevity. And then with your case study for Britain, saying that it was because of this liberalization of trade policy is why they lost their advantage in industry. That advantage in industry seems to be purely a result of their liberalized trade policy and their tearing down of these certain corn laws and other laws that protected aristocratic interests in the country.
Look, in the Japanese case, I agree. The debt is a problem. They have one great advantage over the United States and other countries in that the vast majority of, I don't know what the number is, but the vast majority of Japanese debt is domestically held. We don't have that advantage. So the debt is going to be a much larger problem for us, because what we end up doing is borrowing money from foreign countries to fund foreign consumption. And the Japanese don't do that. So they have a problem. It's a much more solvable problem than our problem. And I would rather, on the debt question, I would rather have their problem than our problem. Look, in terms of Britain, having just reread some of this, all I can tell you is, if my sources are correct, that the industries that Britain built up to become the industrial giant were all built up behind a tariff wall that they began chipping away at in the 1860s, in the early 1860s. And the United States passed Britain as the world's largest economy in 1880, also behind a pretty substantial tariff wall. And by the time the tariff became the central issue in British politics, around 1905, 1904, when Winston Churchill famously crossed the aisle from the Conservatives to the Liberals over the tariff question, Britain's economy looked in a way eerily like ours without big tech, but heavily financialized, dependent on free trading, also dependent on a colonial empire that is clearly gone now, and that was to some extent exploitative. We didn't talk about that. And it masked the structural weakness in the British economy, which became incredibly evident after World War I and was all but bankrupted by 1945, not just because of wartime spending either, although that's what's often ascribed to, but because of the way they shifted their tariff policy beginning in the middle of the 19th century. It took a long time for that bill to come due, but when it did, the British economy was crippled and basically has never recovered.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shri, and I'm a first-year student at the University of Notre Dame. So, Professor Otteson, you said in your concluding remarks that worrying about American jobs and general prosperity being shipped overseas would constitute xenophobia. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about that. Specifically, do you believe that it is always immoral for a nation to prioritize its own citizens over those of another? And if so, what's the purpose of a nation-state in the first place?
Great question. So no, that's not what I meant to imply, if that's what I said. The claim that we should worry about jobs going to other countries because they are in other countries by itself sounds to me like we're starting to think about an us versus them view of the world. I don't think that's a productive way of thinking about the world. On the other hand, if the question is, and I think that is part of your question, is should a country's policies first and put its own citizens first where they come into contest with other countries? Certainly, but I would caution this. So I would give this one caution. It's that we have to be very careful with that, because there's one thing to say, well, we want to concentrate our attention and focus our attention on enabling our citizens to improve their lives. It's a very short distance between that and saying, oh, and we do that by depressing the lives of others. So when I said it a couple of minutes ago about viewing the world in positive-sum terms rather than zero-sum terms, that's extremely important. And I think we're quite liable to thinking about the world in zero-sum, in which there are two ways that I can gain. Either I gain by improving myself, or I gain by lowering other people. And it's that second part that I think is extremely worrisome. We need to be very careful to guard ourselves against that.
Okay. Gentlemen, let me just applaud you for your short answers. I'll try to get through as many student questions. So students, again, very simple questions, not simple questions, very short questions, and gentlemen, as best you can, short answers.
I'm Lily Gilson from the University of Lake Ross in New Orleans. I have a question for Dr. Otteson. If limiting freedom in the markets is disrespectful of human dignity, then how else can we curb immorality in markets? Is there a way, in your opinion, to make a moral market without restrictive regulations?
I'm not sure I caught quite all of that. Could you just get a little closer to the microphone for me?
Sorry.
Maybe just at the last part.
If one of the gentlemen can lower the microphone a little bit, that might be helpful.
Or just tilt it.
Thanks. Is there a way, in your opinion, to make a moral market without restrictive regulations?
Is there a way to get a more moral market without restrictive regulations?
Yeah, in your opinion.
Well, potentially, sure. So yes, the short answer, I'll give you the short answer. I think we sometimes look at the instruments rather than the agents. So if people are making bad choices in markets or in other realms, then the first place we should look is the people themselves. And the best way to deal with people, I think, who are making decisions, leading their lives in ways we think are either destructive to themselves or to others, is by reasoning with them and talking to them. So good moral witness, I think, goes a long way. And also the other part of that is expressing our negative judgments when we have negative judgments.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm PJ Butler here at junior here at Notre Dame. Professor Otteson, in your opening remarks, you recommended that our regulation of markets acknowledge what you called a diversity of visions of the good life. While I can at least understand the rationale of your argument at the individual level, how does this restraint translate to the level of national policymaking? As Professor Anton suggested, while we cannot hope to solve every problem, the statesmen who shape our nation's economic agenda will ultimately make choices that prioritize some interests over others. Shouldn't the federal government be working on the next Manhattan Project, interstate highway system, or Apollo program instead of letting American corporations export the pathologies of our liberal regime to the rest of the world?
Those are my only two choices. So I would say two quick things. One, I think taking individual human dignity seriously is important, and I think it's very easy for us to disregard that when it comes to other people. So one of the fallacies I think we tend to make is, and we're all liable to it, myself included, but we're all liable to think that it's sort of the I am the world fallacy is what I call it. That means that everybody else should really be just like me, and if they aren't, they're making some kind of mistake. Well, one of the things that I think I would emphasize is that if we take human dignity seriously, what that means is a little bit of intellectual humility, where we don't have to deny that there is such a thing as virtuous or vicious ways of living, better or worse ways of living. We don't even have to give up on the idea that there is a single conception of the good. What it does ask us to do, however, is when we have a country of 330 million people, if we decide that we want to enforce and impose a single conception, and we've tried this before, so it's not as if we have to just try to imagine what would happen, what you usually get is bloodshed. One compromise, it's a second best in a world of fallen creatures, is to say, is there a set of institutions that could enable us to live together while pursuing our conceptions of the good without having to kill one another? That's the promise or the potential promise of the kind of limited and free government that I'm suggesting. So that doesn't mean that we can't do things that would benefit us all, but it does say we have to be very careful in saying that because I think something would benefit me or the people that I know, or I think it's a good idea, therefore people who think otherwise are making a mistake, and it's okay for me to go ahead and override their preferences and their choices. That's the dangerous road I think it's very easy to begin going down.
Dr. Anton, you said Japan had an economic boom because it was not greatly indulging in free trade, but rather engaging in a kind of mercantilist market. How do you think a mercantilist market is more beneficial than unregulated free trade?
I think that the great industrialized economies of the world, the most industrialized economies, historically practiced, if you want to call it mercantilism, I usually think of that word slightly differently, but I'm not averse to it in this context. So the United States, Germany, Great Britain, Japan practiced that in their rise to full industrialization and to capturing the industries that as a country you would most want to have, that pay the highest wages, that generate the most amount of GDP, that generate the most high quality jobs, that are the most fruitful in spreading innovation to other industries, and so that have force multiplier effects. This is very easy to see in the history of East Asia, especially post-World War II, where you either had very poor countries that never had an industrial sector at all, South Korea being the primary example here, and Japan, which obviously was the most industrialized country in East Asia before World War II, but was mostly destroyed before you even get to the atomic bombings, but by conventional bombings, B-29s, and by the amount of military spending on Japanese Navy and aircraft, all of which are sunk or shot down during the war. Japan was a very poor country in 1945 and built back all those industries and built brand new industries and world-beating companies that are still thriving today, essentially behind a tariff wall and with an industrial policy. And these things just happened, and they are historical rebukes, I think, to the argument that these kinds of things never work and always lead to economic doom, depression, I was going to say depravity. That's maybe the wrong word. Deprivation. No, in fact, if you want to compare, maybe the starkest comparison of all is standard of living, per capita income, life expectancy, et cetera, in South Korea, 1945 to today, or pick a year. It could be 1988 when Seoul got the Olympics, sort of South Korea's coming out party to the world, like we've arrived. This is perhaps the most rapid development of economic, technological sophistication and standards of living in the history of the world, and it all happened with the deliberate application of policies that if one was going to be a strict economic liberal, you would have had to say that that couldn't possibly have worked, and yet there it is. There they are, I would say.
South Korea was dwarfed by Hong Kong, and I'm interested to know why you haven't mentioned Hong Kong.
South Korea.
Hong Kong, let me finish. Hong Kong's economic development during the same period dwarfed what you got in South Korea, and your claim that somehow because there were tariffs in place, that's the cause of the production is like saying Jesse Owens ran so fast because he wore heavy shoes with steel spikes. So therefore, everybody today should wear heavy shoes with steel spikes.
South Korea is
there are many
absolutely
other
not
things
dwarfed
that
by
go
Hong Kong.
into a nation's policy and successes, and many of the actual policies that were implemented were the getting rid of policies that were preventing people from enabling them to increase their prosperity.
Hong Kong.
So you have a wide range of things that were gotten rid of. Not all of them, because we don't live in a perfect world, and you're pointing to the few that remained and saying that those are the things that actually cause the productivity. And I think you're giving an extremely truncated
and always has been
simplistic
a one
analysis.
industry town. It's a finance town. That's how it got rich, and it's inconceivable that Hong Kong could have gotten the way it is without being a colony of Great Britain, and B, the only gateway
You mean its policy of benign
input to
neglect?
capital in Asia, inbound and outbound, when the mainland was effectively communistic. Does Hong Kong today have a world-class auto industry? It does not. Does it have today a world-class washing machine and dryer industry? It doesn't. Does it have the best TV flat screen industry? No. Does it have the only industry that competes with the iPhone in the Samsung, whatever the heck they call it? It doesn't. It doesn't have
Does
any
it
of
have
that.
a good football team?
It doesn't have any of that
Does it
stuff.
have a good
If we're
baseball
talking
team?
about economic policy and industry, South Korea blows Hong Kong out of the water. It's not even a competition.
Let's get another question in, please.
I'm Jason Delgado from Regent University, and my question is to Professor Otteson, which is, how can we say that the liberal free market economy that we've had for the past couple of decades encourages or promotes human freedom when we see today in the Midwest, the deindustrialized Midwest, and in Appalachia, so many people who are suffering economically and who die these deaths of despair because they have had these jobs taken away from them, they've had this industry leave them. How are they any more free under this economy than maybe an economy that had more regulations promoting the common good?
Yeah, so it's a good question. One thing to begin with is compared to what? What's the alternative that you would suggest? Now, if the only thing we care about is freedom, that might give us an answer or might lead in the kind of direction it sounds like you're suggesting. But those same people, so there are many pathologies that go on in the United States. Are all of them due to liberalism as a set of institutions or to markets as a set of institutions? At least some of them are. But I think if you point to particular either bad actors or bad situations in a market economy, that misunderstands I would say, the argument, the moral argument in favor of the kind of argument that I've given for markets, or the moral argument for markets, in the following way. It's like pointing to the fact that people die as a rejection for modern medicine. The question has to be compared to what? Is it going to be perfect? It will never be perfect. But if you look at other countries who have other kinds of policies, including exactly the kinds of policies that my interlocutor is talking about, and let's actually compare the kinds of situations in which they live, then I think that begins to generate an argument for adopting human freedom as a default, maybe a robust default. Is it a default that you can never override? No, but you better have pretty good reason.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nick Pruitt from Southwest Baptist University with ISI, and I have a question for whichever one of you would like to answer. And so my question revolves around the view that either the Hayek view, free market view, or the protectionist view, are either of those views conducive to tackling the issue of the soaring national debt and effectively addressing this?
Well, it depends if you mean specifically the debt, or do you mean the deficit? And they're related and they're different questions. And then I would ask, do you also mean the trade deficit, which is a separate and third question? Okay, so if specifically you mean the debt, that's the money the Treasury issues that gets bought by domestic and foreign investors, it could tackle the debt, because a big reason why we have such a high national debt is because we, basically look, there's three essential ways that you pay for goods you import. First of all, you can just not import any goods. Nobody's arguing for that. That's a ridiculous position, right? So you either pay for them with goods that you produce via export or the money you earn off of them. You pay for it by selling off existing assets in your country, such as office buildings and things. One-time sales. Those things once built, they exist, and that's all there is. You're not producing more of them on an ongoing basis as part of your industry. Or you borrow money to keep financing the imports. And we've been doing a combination of 2 and 3, and as most assets, the big asset sales got going in the 80s. It was a political issue at the time, and mostly the politics of it has been resolved in a free market direction, which is, unless there's some kind of national security thing, like we can't let China buy Lockheed Martin, anything short of that we should allow to happen, because that's the market. But the problem is most of the assets foreign companies want have been gobbled up, and so that's slowed down considerably. That leaves buying imports on debt. If you imported less, you'd have to borrow less to finance this level of consumption. So yes, we could, if not necessarily solve the problem, we could help address the problem, borrow less, and watch the debt curve lower over time, but we're not on the glide path to doing that at all right now. We're in fact doing the opposite, and so the problem continues to grow and get worse. And when or how it will be solved absent some kind of collapse of the dollar or other calamity, I don't know. But right now, if I had to bet, and I don't like to ever bet on anything, I would just bet on the calamity, because the problem is so well known and politicians have done nothing to try to do anything about it that I would just assume they're just going to let whatever's going to happen happen.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm a student here at Notre Dame. My question is for Professor Otteson. So you appealed to human dignity several times in your argument, but it seems that the modern professional managerial class suffers from a general lack of dignity. Bankers and lawyers work obscene hours, worse than ever before. People are on all sorts of anxiety medicine, and more people are taking Adderall just to get through their day-to-day job. This isn't a lifestyle anyone would choose freely. Instead, it's clearly brought about by the market system. So how can you say that this system is the best one for human dignity?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a terrible way to live. If your question is that a good thing? Living, is that what your question is?
Well, the question is, it seems like that's caused by the market system.
Oh, no. Okay, so thank you. So if the question is it bad to work all of these hours and take Adderall, et cetera? Yes. Is that a good way to live? No. What's causing it? Why are people choosing to do that? Because if you say that the people who choose to live like that are doing it because they don't have any other options, well, that's just false. They have plenty of other options. They're choosing it for some other reason. So I think your question is downstream of the real issue. The real issue is they haven't had any time or taken any time to think about what actually is a good human life worth living. And is this contributing to a good human life? That's the real cause. So I don't think it has anything to do with economic forces or government forces forcing them to do that, because none of the people who are doing, I would suspect what you're talking about, have been forced into it by any person or by any institution. But what they haven't yet done, and maybe they should, is taken the opportunity to think about, what do I consider to be a life well lived, a life of meaning and purpose, and can this be a step in that direction, or is it in fact taking me very far away from that, despite whatever other benefits it might be giving?
I'll give a different answer to your question that I think is somewhat more, let us say, sympathetic to the premise of it. As somebody who worked in these industries and for some of these firms, I saw what it was like for people your age, going in, and it's hell. It is true hell. And while it is true that you don't have to do it, it's voluntary. Nobody forces you into it. It's very different today than it used to be. That is to say, the job itself and what is demanded of you by these firms is basically a kind of take it or leave it. You're going to sign your soul over to us. Or you forget it, go somewhere else. And then your go somewhere else options are a lot more constrained than they used to be, in part because of the restructuring of the economy, much more toward finance, which now accounts for somewhere, depending on the year and Wall Street profits, 40 to 50% of the US economy profitability and wages, not wages, but profitability and earnings, whereas it used to be fractions of that. And there were a lot more options available to you to enter the middle class at a more sustainable pace and so on. And basically what the finance firms have done to their own benefit, somewhat cynically but very in keeping with market principles, is they've restructured the job and the industry such that they want to squeeze the maximum amount of blood out of you as labor, knowing that that's great for them. Their profitability goes up when they work you that hard. And you don't really have options if you want to be in that industry. And your options for being outside that industry, especially because the differential is so great and gets greater every year, are fewer and fewer. So they know that they're in the driver's seat in terms of the bargaining position. And that's why they can get away with forcing that kind of lifestyle on people in a way that they couldn't a generation or two or three or four ago. And yeah, I think that's very much market-driven in a way that I think is unhealthy for society and not great, and that could be ameliorated by certain better policies that would still be liberal, would still allow for plenty of economic freedom, but wouldn't necessarily force the system we have now onto us.
Okay, there's a lot of students, and here's how we're going to get the student questions answered. We're going to take one more question, and it's going to be for the gentleman on crutches, because I feel bad that he's standing on crutches. No, but for the rest of you students, we're going to have a dinner, the ISI dinner, and we'll save some time at the dinner for all the students who are in line to ask their questions there, okay? So we'll get your questions answered, but we're past time already, and we have a dinner waiting for us, so we're going to take one more student question for now.
Thank you. Professor Anton, after the musician Alexander Hamilton instituted the whiskey tax, there is a strong increase in impoverishment in Appalachia until the Washington Army actually marched into Appalachia to force tax to be taken. Would that hint that the free market was actually the inducer of providing value to Appalachia, or was it the tax itself?
Good question. Tough one. Of course, the rebellion was put down without a shot, which leads one to wonder how serious the people doing the rebelling took it. It was, I have to say, you left out, though, an important issue that drove that policy, which was a moral question, right? Which gets also to this whole question of individual freedom. How far do you take it, right? If we're going to just let people decide and make bad decisions, then, why is heroin illegal, right? Why don't we allow U.S. pharmaceutical companies to create it and market it and sell it at CVS, right? On pure economics, we would of course allow that. For moral and reasons of societal health, we don't. And the founders were very worried about these questions of morality and societal health. And they absolutely didn't have a problem with government intervening in the market to restrict certain products or to influence demand for certain products precisely to, if not outright ban them, which they thought would go too far or was too tyrannical or would go too against the grain of the American character, to get their consumption down would be a good thing. So that particular tax was less an economic instrument or a revenue raiser than it was a moral question that the founders were trying. What they thought was, basically they thought certain people in America just drank too much whiskey. You need to drink less, and this was one of the ways that we could tamp down demand. I mean, Jefferson had a lot of great ideas in his life, and some of them were a little silly, and some of them were better than others. I personally like this one, although it never made policy. He says, what we need to do to fix the American people, we'll get them to stop drinking whiskey and start drinking wine. This is going to be a great country if we can fix it. And I think to me, that's brilliant. I love it. But then if you say, how do you implement that by a policy? I don't know. But that's what they were thinking about, and they were worried about primarily with that action.
So much work for the philosopher kings to do.
For those going to the ISI dinner, it's just across the quad. I'm going to ask the Notre Dame students to help guide all the other students over to the forum in Nick Jenkins Nanovic Hall. This is the first time we've done an event quite this way, and it seems to me it was a great success. So please join me in thanking Professor Otteson and Professor Anton.
Did I get this from you? Thanks.